Okay, so I mentioned that today's session is on implementing drag and drop. I think it's an interesting session. We'll have some new methods to look at and some new interaction blocks to look at that we haven't seen in any of the previous sessions. So it should be new material, for some of you at least. Today's session I don't think will be particularly long. I was just looking to see about how many slides we have in the slide deck, and it looks like only about 20 slides or so, and then we'll look at a few examples in Studio as well, but I don't think it will take more than, let's say, maybe an hour or a few minutes longer than an hour today. So this should be a nice break from those long sessions we had early on in our Tuesday training sessions. So I don't think it will run an hour and a half today like I have on the slide, but if it does, we'll discuss taking a break if we need to. I always show a few slides about the interface that we're using, the GoToTraining Interface. Most of you, I think, are familiar with it. But if you need to leave or come back and leave again, it doesn't bother anyone, so you can feel free to do that. It won't bother me. I won't even know you've disappeared. But if you do miss part of the session and you want to catch back up later, you can always watch the recording. We always record the session, and it usually takes, a day or so. Usually by tomorrow morning, I'll have the recording posted out there. I've been posting it in the instructor-led training page, right there where you normally would register for a session. I replaced that link with a watch recording link, so you can get to it from there. You can also get to it later if you need to, when maybe that section there on the Tuesday training sessions is gone. You'll be able to still look at the recordings or watch the recordings from our online video website as well. So we put them in there, at least a few of them are there, and I'll make it a policy to get the rest of those moved over when our sessions are finished. So you'll be able to look at them later, one way or the other. So if you have questions while the session is ongoing, I usually will notice them if you use the chat interface. It creates a little bubble that sometimes catches my attention out of the corner of my eye. But if it doesn't catch my attention and I don't catch it before the session's over, send me an email, and my email address is right here on the screen, lchildress@4jays.com. Here's what the interface looks like. We have our viewing area on the left. Over here, where you'll be able to see the slides from the presentation. And then over on the right-hand side is the interface that you can use to control what you see. Let me get a better screenshot of that on the next slides. So here's what it looks like all blown up, so you can see it better. You can switch to telephone mode if you need to. If you're having a problem with the speakers on your computer, you can always use this telephone toggle. And if you click on that, you should be able to see a telephone number that you can use to call in and listen to the session that way. This red arrow up here at the top on the left, lost my highlighter, hang on a second. You can use to flatten the control panel or minimize the control panel so that you don't see it taking up all your screen real estate. You've got the mute button, which in your case is already muted because I muted everyone prior to the session starting. That way if you talk, it doesn't disturb anyone else and you don't have to worry about anyone else hearing you speak while the session's going on. And there's the raise hand icon that every once in a while I'll ask you to click on so that I can make sure that everyone hears me okay, or make sure that everyone is still able to see okay. Sometimes the screen freezes as well, and I'll check on that periodically. So the objectives for this session are to learn all about drag and drop and how to implement drag and drop. So we'll be looking at various examples. You can use drag and drop with a simple list to reposition items, objects within a simple list. You can use drag and drop between lists within a Genero program, and you can even implement drag and drop between a Genero program and another Genero program. So you drag items from one program list to another Genero program list, or even a non-Genero program. a compatible desktop application, for example, like Excel. I can drag and drop items from a Genero list, for example, to an Excel spreadsheet. So those are all possibilities with drag and drop. Those are all supported. And we'll look at how to get started with implementing drag and drop in this session. So we just went over the possible drag and drop operations on the previous slide, but here you can see a sample from a program called Orders and Trucks. You can find a lot of good sample drag and drop programs as well as a lot of the other features in the Genero language in the FGLDir demo directory. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's actually a lot of examples and good sample code that you can use to get started with an unfamiliar feature. They're in that demo directory. So the examples I'll be showing you today have come from there. I've just imported some of those code samples and form files into Studio so that we could get a good look at what the code looks like for those. And you can do the same thing at home if you're interested. So again, drag and drop allows the user to drag and drop within a list, a single list, reposition items in the list. You can drag and drop between lists or even drag and drop between programs that are other Genero programs or even other compatible desktop applications. Drag and drop is only supported in the display array interactive instruction or dialog. It's not supported in any of the other dialogues like input or input array. So you'll notice everything we look at will be a display array dialog. So here's the example of Orders and Trucks. Just to grab a marker. They're showing you here an example of a table container here on the left. And then we've got a tree view container over here on the right. So something else to know about drag and drop is that it's supported with simple list containers, table containers, and tree view containers. Those are the two types of containers that you can use to implement drag and drop. So here they have a combination. They have a simple table container on the left, and they can drag and drop items from the table container on the left to the tree view container on the right, or vice versa, depending on what the code is allowing them to do. But it's all supported, right? We can move the rows back and forth between the table container and the tree view container. Here's another example of drag and drop in just a simple list. And again, it can be a table or a tree container. So we see both in this example. So here's someone just dragging and dropping items in a single list, really just repositioning objects in a list. So drag and drop can be within a list, like we see over here on the left, and we've got the same scenario over here on the right, except that they're using a tree view container instead of a table container. But the user can grab a row over here in the tree view container and reposition it to a different location in the tree view container. So that's drag and drop within a list. Here's examples of drag and drop between lists. So in this case, we actually have over here on the left, we have two table containers, one displayed on the left side and one displayed on the right side, and the user is allowed to drag and drop items from either list to the other list on the other side. So over here on the left, they can grab an item from the list and drag it over to the list on the right, and vice versa. And then over here on the right side of the slide, we have the same scenario, except this time it's between a table container and a tree view container. But the user is allowed to grab items from the list over here on the left and drag them over to the tree view container on the right, and tree view container over to the list, vice versa. Notice also, you can tell from looking at this table container on the left here that multiple row select is also supported. So if you implement multiple row select, like we discussed in some of our previous sessions, you can also allow the user to drag multiple rows from one list to the other. So that's just a function of multiple row selection, the other feature that we've talked about previously. And then finally, the third example is drag and drop between programs. And the example they've chosen to show you is actually drag and drop between a Genero program and an external program, a mail tool in this example. Grab my highlighter. So the user is allowed to, in this case, drag an item from a list over here on the left side of the screen and drag it over to an external program, which looks like Outlook in this case. So that's another supported feature of drag and drop. We'll talk a little bit more about using drag and drop between Genero programs and external programs a little bit later in the session. But it is supported. It just requires more attention and more coding on your part to make sure that works properly. One second. It looks like I have a message. Let me just make sure I haven't missed a question. Looks okay. All right, so steps to implement drag and drop. This is what we're going to spend the remainder of the session on, is learning how to implement drag and drop. And to do that, there's a few things we have to learn. There's a new class that we haven't looked at in previous sessions called the UI.dragDrop class that has a lot of good methods that we can use to manage drag and drop behavior. So we'll be looking at a lot of those methods in this session. We also have some interaction blocks that we haven't talked about previously. You can see those listed here on the screen. But we'll be taking a good look at those in the next several pages and the code examples in Studio later. So you'll get a good look at them. So one of the first things we have to do when we're implementing drag and drop, back up here to step 1, is create a variable to provide a reference to the drag and drop object that the user's trying to drag over, let's say, to another list, maybe even in a different program. So that's one of the first steps, is to define a drag drop object of type UI.dragDrop, and that's going to represent a reference to the object that the user's dragging. We talked earlier that drag and drop is supported with table and tree view containers, so of course you have to define a table or tree view container on your form. I mentioned also earlier that drag and drop is supported with the display array dialog. That's actually the only interactive instruction that drag and drop is supported for, so of course you have to have display array defined. And then embedded in that display array dialog, that's where you'll see or implement your OnDragStart, OnDragFinished, and so on interaction blocks to control the behavior of drag and drop. And to implement drag and drop, you actually are not allowed to drag an object unless you've defined an OnDragStart interaction block, for example. So it's actually required to be able to use drag and drop. Same thing here for OnDrop. The OnDrop interaction block is required before a dialog will accept a drop operation. So some of these interaction blocks are actually required to even be able to implement drag and drop, and some of them, as we'll see, are optional. So we'll be taking a look at those interaction blocks and a lot of these methods in the drag-drop class here in the next several pages. So here is a list of some of the drag-drop class methods that are important for implementing drag and drop. We'll see additional ones as we look at the code samples, but this is all I could comfortably fit on the page. So notice first thing here is that all the UI drag-drop methods are object methods. So we have to get a reference to the drag-drop object before we can actually use these methods. I'm going to start down here at the bottom, which sounds a little strange, and then we'll go back up to the top. But the first method we'll look at here is the SetOperation method. And the SetOperation method is used to define the type of drag and drop operation that you want to allow in the dialog. So there's really three options with this set operation. So you're going to pass it a parameter that specifies or defines the type of operation you want the user to be able to use. Now the only real choices for the user are move and copy. Right, so move, of course, implies that you're, let's say, dragging an object over to another list, for example, and then you're actually going to delete that object, that row, for example, from the source list when you move it. A copy operation, of course, implies that you're going to drag an object over, let's say, to another list, insert it in the other list, the new list, and also keep that row in its same position in the source list. Right, so a copy means I'm not going to delete a dragged object from the source list once I've moved it to a new list. So those are the two operations that a user would be able to apply, right? A copy or a move. And typically we use the OnDragStart interaction block to use this set operation method to define the type of operation we want to allow, either copy or move. But you also will see in some of these examples that you can use set operation to deny a drag and drop operation. Maybe there's some sort of condition that comes up that causes you to want to terminate drag and drop or not allow the drop operation. And you use set operation and pass it a null parameter to disable a drag and drop operation. So you'll see a lot of examples of that. So that's used fairly often. You might see that, for example, in OnDragEnter, OnDragOver blocks, where the user's dragging the object into a list in order to drop it. And maybe there's something about the target row that he selects to drop on, or maybe something about the data in the drag and drop buffer that the application doesn't like. And it can deny the drop by using this set operation and passing it a null parameter. So we'll see that later. Now let's go back up to the top and look at add possible operation. So add possible operation allows a user to, let's say, add an allowed drag and drop operation or toggle between an allowed drag and drop operation. So the possible operations, again, would be either move or copy. And if you wanted to allow it, you could specify add possible operation and specify the other operation. That didn't make a lot of sense. So let me try again. Let's say I use the set operation method in my OnDragStart interaction block, and I define the type of drag and drop operation that I want to allow as a move. And then later in my code, I determine that I also want to allow the user to copy. So that means he could either move or copy. So in order to implement the copy operation as being allowed, I can use this add possible operation method, pass it a copy operation, and now the user can either do a move or a copy. So hopefully I was a little more clear that time. So it allows you to add allowed drag and drop operations. Instead of just having one allowed operation, I can have one or two. The drop internal method that you see here is a handy method that you can use when the source list that you're dragging the object from is also the target list. Right? So you're just using drag and drop within a list or a tree view container. And it saves a lot of coding just to use this drop internal method instead of having to code the insert of the row, let's say, into the list and then deleting the row from its previous location in the list. There's a kind of a built-in method that will do all that coding for you. So it's just a convenience. Drop internal when the target list is also the source list. getLocationRow is used to return the index of the row the mouse is pointing to during drag and drop, and it's the index of the target row. So let's say that the user is dragging a row from the list on the left over to the list on the right. If I use Get Location Row, it's going to return the index of the row on the right, the target list that the cursor is pointing to for the drop. So that's how you identify the location in the list that's being specified for the drop operation. Get operation is a method that just returns the current type of operation. So it'll either return move, copy, or null. Right? Those are our three possible types of operations for drag and drop. So that will tell us what the current operation type is. And then set buffer copies the text data of the dragged object into the drag and drop buffer. So that's how you can set the buffer contents for drag and drop. So those are a few of the drag and drop methods available to us to manage the behavior and what goes on with the drag and drop operation. There's several more methods, and we'll be seeing some of those in the next part of our session here, the rest of our presentation. So we looked at the different methods, or at least some of the drag-drop methods that we'll be using to implement drag and drop. And now we're looking at the interaction blocks that you use to enable drag and drop in a list, and also to manage the behavior of drag and drop during the drag and drop operation. So let's take a look at these briefly because we'll be seeing them in more detail as we go along. So I'm going to grab a pen this time. This OnDragStart and OnDragFinished interaction blocks, those two interaction blocks are triggered in the source dialog when a drag and drop operation is initiated. So OnDragStart will be initiated at the beginning of a drag operation in the source dialog where the user is selecting, let's say, a row in the list to drag. So that initiates or triggers OnDragStart. OnDragFinish is also triggered in the source dialog where the user has actually started the drag operation, and OnDragFinished is used to trigger or let the source dialog know that a drag operation has finished. So those two interaction blocks are both triggered on the source dialog, right, or in the source dialog where the drag operation is initiated. The rest of these interaction blocks, the OnDragEnter, OnDragOver, and OnDrop interaction blocks are all triggered in the target dialog. All right, Lois, thank you. Lois just pointed out that we're having a little bit of audio problems, so I'm going to straighten up. I'm kind of leaning forward. And Lois, keep me posted. If it gets any worse, let me know, and I'll try to do better. I do have a tendency to bend over so I can see the screen better. Is that better? Okay, thanks. All right, so OnDragStart, OnDragFinished are triggered in the source dialog where the drag and drop operation are initiated. OnDragEnter, OnDragOver, and OnDrop, I'm having trouble pronouncing that one for some reason, are triggered in the target dialog. Right? So the user's dragging an object, let's say, into a target array. That dialog will actually be the ones with OnDragEnter, DragOver, and OnDrop triggered. So let's take a look at these in more detail. So here's the first one. OnDragStart, I just mentioned, is actually triggered or executed when the user starts the drag operation. So when he starts to drag something from the list associated with the current display array, that triggers the OnDragStart block. Now the OnDragStart block is mandatory. If you want to be able to drag an object from a dialog, like the display array dialog, you have to include the OnDragStart interaction block. Otherwise, it does not allow a drag operation. Thanks, Lois. I don't think I was doing anything special that time, so maybe the audio is just not very good today. I'll try to be real still. So here we're dragging from a display array, and that initiates or triggers the OnDragStart interaction block. And typically what people use the OnDragStart for, grab my highlighter here, is to specify the drag and drop operation that will be allowed. We just talked about a few slides ago when we were talking about some of the methods. So this is where they typically would specify whether or not the user can do a copy or a move operation. And you can see a code sample right down here. Up here at the top, you can see where they're defining a UI.dragAndDrop variable called D&D that's going to have our reference to our dragged object. Here's our display array dialog, and then embedded in our display array dialog, we see this first OnDragStart interaction block. Now notice all the interaction blocks you'll see on the following pages all require this D&D, in this case, our variable that represents our drag-drop object, to be passed to the interaction block. So OnDragStart, there's our variable with our reference to our drag and drop object. And then right here we're using the SetOperation method we discussed a few minutes ago to define the default operation as a move. So as of this point, the user can only do a move operation. But notice right down here, right below the SetOperation, they're also using in the code an add possible operation to add a copy operation to the list of allowed operations. So now the user actually has a choice between doing a move or a copy between, looks like, two lists in this case. So to do a move, for example, you can just click, drag the object with the mouse, just your standard drag and drop behavior. If you want to do a copy, they can use control drag. So that's how they can toggle between the two options. So control drag to copy, they can just click and drag to do a move, since that's the default behavior, or shift drag. Uh-oh, Lois. Is that any better? Lois says the sound just went away. Can you hear me now? Good grief. Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure what's wrong with the audio today. I apologize for it. Usually it's better than this. Oh, good. Okay, it looks like Michael's not having any problems. Polly, okay, thank you, you guys. It looks like some folks are having difficulties and some folks aren't. So thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it. All right, let me make sure I didn't skip something. All right, so we looked at OnDragStart. Looks like I'm in good shape. Okay, so here's OnDragFinished. So OnDragFinished, we talked about a few minutes ago, is also triggered in the source dialog, where that drag operation was first initiated. So the purpose of the OnDragFinished, you can see here, is to notify the dialog where the drag started that the drop operation's completed or possibly terminated. And we typically use the OnDragFinish to get the final operation type, like was it a copy or a move, for example, so that we can do some housekeeping if we need to. And you can see a good example of that down here in the code sample. So I'm going to skip the defining the variable in the display array because you're familiar with that now. And we'll just take a look at this interaction block. So here's OnDragFinished. They've got an if here to check for the type of operation. And they're saying if the operation is a move, then I know that I need to do a little housekeeping since the drag and drop operation have completed at this point. Since it was a move, I need to go back and delete the row from the source list, right? The only place that row should show up now is in the target list. So there's an example of using OnDragFinished to verify, for example, the operation type and to do a little cleanup or housekeeping at the end of a drag and drop operation. Here's OnDragEnter. Now the OnDragEnter is an optional interaction block. It's not required. But you can see here, grab my highlighter, that sometimes it is used to prevent unauthorized types of data from being dropped in the target. So this is probably a good place for us to talk a little more about drag and drop between a Genero program and some sort of external desktop application like Outlook or Excel, for example. Now, any time that you're using drag and drop to drag data to or from an external application, you actually have to identify the type of data that's in that drag and drop buffer. And of course, the reason for that is so that the target application or the application that's accepting the drop will know how to handle that data. The file extension is not considered adequate. You know, like a lot of us rely on the file extension like a .doc, for example. But in the Internet world, that's not really considered adequate. And instead, the Internet standard is to use something called a MIME type. Sometimes it's also referred to as an Internet media type, I believe. So this MIME type is how we define the type of data in the drag and drop buffer. Now, we'll see a few of these methods, special methods we have for the drag drop class that we can use to work with MIME types, for example, to determine what type of data is in the buffer, which is what we see here with the select MIME type. We also have methods that we can use to set the MIME type for data that's going into a drag and drop buffer to be, let's say, dragged over to an external application. So in any case, when we're dragging and dropping to external applications, the MIME type is something we have to be concerned with. We have to identify the type of data so that the Genero application or the external application understand how to handle that data in the dragged buffer. So that's what we're looking at here. In this case, we've got some data being dragged from an external application, perhaps, to a Genero program. And right here in our OnDragEnter interaction block, we're checking the type of data in the drag and drop buffer. We're passing the select MIME type method text plain, and that's going to check the buffer to see if the data available in the buffer is plain text, and if it is, it's going to return a true. So if it is plain text, then we're going to allow a copy operation, and if it's not plain text, notice down here at the bottom in the else, we're actually going to disable the drag and drop operation. So I think this is your first example of seeing how you can disable the drag and drop right here. So they're going to check the data type or the type of data in the drag and drop buffer. If it's not plain text, they're disabling the operation. And to disable the operation, set operation and then pass it null. So you'll probably see that a lot in the code samples that we'll see here in the PowerPoint presentation, as well as in the samples of code we see in Studio a little bit later. Now, something else I don't think we've seen yet is the set backup feedback method. Having a hard time talking today, it looks like, but the set feedback method is used to define the visual effect when the user is dragging the object. So, for example, there's a set feedback insert that you could specify. That's actually the default. So if you don't use the set feedback method to define the feedback, you get insert. And that creates the interesting kind of bar effect that you see so that you can tell where a row is going to be inserted into a list. And I'll point that out to you later when we look at the actual examples in Studio. There's also a feedback of select trying to remember what they are. There's insert, select, and all that we see here. So insert uses the bar so that you can determine where the row would be landing in the target list. Select actually puts a little box around the row, the target row that you're hovering over with the cursor. And set feedback all makes it clear that there is no particular place in the list. So that you use the set feedback all when you don't really care where what the target row is in a list. So it doesn't use a bar to identify where it will be dropped. It doesn't use a box to identify the row that you're hovering over. It just is kind of a blank sheet, so to speak. Okay. So here is OnDragOver, and OnDragOver is also an optional interaction block. Grab my highlighter here. A lot of times what we're using the OnDragOver for is to actually deny a drop based on some condition. Perhaps we've identified that the data in the drag and drop buffer is not the right type of data to be allowed for the drop. Maybe the user's trying to drop the drag and drop buffer onto a row that doesn't accept the drop, like we see in this case. Some sort of condition where we want to deny the drop. That's typically what the OnDragOver block is used for. So this OnDragOver block is triggered in the target dialog, right, where the drag operation is taking place, right? They've dragged an object to a list, let's say, and they're moving over or hovering over the target area. That initiates the OnDragOver. Notice, too, that you have to have OnDrop defined in the target dialog before the OnDragOver will be triggered. Same thing for OnDragEnter. I don't remember if I mentioned that before. But OnDragEnter and OnDragOver require OnDrop to be defined in that target dialog before they will be triggered and executed. It also gets triggered if the user changes between a copy or a move operation. So other than that, it only gets called once per row. So regardless of whether you drag it over the same row twice, drag the mouse, the cursor over the row more than once, this block of code will only get executed the one time per row, right? Once per row. So it is optional, and you only need it if there's the drop might be denied based on the row targeted by the user. Maybe it doesn't accept a drop for some reason, or maybe it's not happy with the type of data that's in the drag and drop buffer. Those would be reasons to use the OnDragOver. And then finally, the last interaction block, I believe this is the last one, I think we've talked about all the others, is the OnDrop interaction block. So I mentioned earlier that you can't drop an object in a list unless the OnDrop interaction block is defined for that dialog, so it is required. And it's executed or triggered when the end user is actually attempting to drop the dragged object, right? He's released the mouse button to drop an object, so that's what triggers it. It also doesn't get triggered if you have used the method we saw a few minutes ago, the SetOperation method, to disable or deny the drop. Right? If we've used that and set it to null, that will cause the OnDrop to not be executed or triggered. So if you've denied the drop in OnDragOver or OnDragEnter, that will cause the OnDrop to just be ignored, we'll say. So here's OnDrop, just a small code snippet. And then they're using this OnDrop down here to set the capacity to the contents of the drag and drop buffer. So that's where also if you were doing a move or a copy, It's one place that you could do all of your housekeeping to insert the row, for example, into the new list and delete it from the source list. You could do all of that in the OnDrop interaction block. All right, so that was the last interaction block. We've looked at all of them. So here is just a few more examples to look at before we take a look at Studio. Here's a simple list. So an example here of just moving an object to a different position in the same, let's say, array, display array dialog. Right? So moving within a simple list. So for this example, it's fairly straightforward and simple. They've only used 2 of the interaction blocks. Both of these are required, so we had to use them. We've got the OnDragStart here to allow a drag operation in this dialog, and then we've got the OnDrop to allow a drop operation in this dialog. So both of those would be required for the user to be able to drag a row in the list and reposition it at a different position in the same list. So we're using OnDragStart here to define the type of operation as a move. And notice, since it is an internal operation, right, the drag and the drop are all taking place within the same list, they're allowed to use this kind of built-in code, the dnd.dropInternal method that has all the code already built in to do that move operation. So that saves the programmer a lot of coding. Makes life a little easier for us. So remember that we see up here we have a table container example, but it also works for tree view containers. All of these examples are table containers or tree view containers. Now, a more complex example, of course, would be moving an item, dragging and dropping between 2 lists. So we actually have a couple of pages here with code for implementing drag and drop between lists. Now the example we see on the screen, I think I'll grab maybe a pen this time, shows that the user looks like they're moving a row from the list on the left to the list on the right. Right, so we're dragging and dropping from the left dialog to the right dialog. So what we're seeing over here with the code is the first display array dialog. So this is the display array for the list on the left, right? Display array, array left, and they're displaying it to the screen record on the left. So that's what we have over here. Now on the next page, when we change the slide to the next slide, we'll see the display array dialog for the right side. So let's just take a quick look here. So for the display array on the left side, with the user dragging an item from the left list over to the right list, that's going to actually trigger this OnDragStart that they're using here to, looks like, to set variables to track the source of the drag and what row was dragged, right, the row that was selected for the drag. So that gets triggered when the user drags something from the left side. And it's also going to trigger the OnDragFinished block when the user actually completes the drop, right? He releases the cursor, or if the drop gets terminated, that will trigger the OnDragFinished. Now the rest of these interaction blocks we see here, like OnDragEnter, grab my pen, OnDrop, are not going to be triggered in this dialog. They'll be triggered instead for the other dialog, right? The list that we're actually dragging and dropping to. We'll call it the target dialog. So we see all this code here for what we want to happen on a drop operation, a drop event, but it won't get triggered here in this dialog. It'll actually be triggered in the display array for the right side, the list on the right. So let's go over there and take a look at that on the next slide. So now we're looking at the display array for the list on the right, right? Display array, array right to the screen record on the right. So now we're looking at the dialog for this side. So when the user drags an object over to this list on the right, it's not going to trigger the OnDragStart or OnDragFinished for this dialog, but it will trigger the OnDragEnter when it enters this visual boundaries here for this dialog, and it will trigger the OnDrop when the user actually tries to drop the dragged object. So just these two interaction blocks will be executed on this right side dialog. So now we can actually see what happens when the user attempts the drop. It checks the drag source, right? It says, okay, if the drag was initiated here inside this list, the list on the right, I'm going to use the shortcut, the drop internal method, and that will do all the coding just to insert this row at a different position in the list. Otherwise, if the dragged object came from the list on the left, I have more code to do. I'm going to find the target row. That's what the getLocationRow method will do, so that it knows where to insert the row that was dragged over. And then the rest of this is just code to go ahead and insert the row into the right list and delete it from the left list. It's already highlighted, so I can't really, there we go. Now you can see it. So that will actually delete the row from the list on the left. So that's a pretty good example of OnDragEnter, OnDrop, OnDragEnter and OnDrop. Now something else that we didn't see here, let me go back for just a minute, that's important, is just because we had limited space on the slide, we didn't have room to show you that this is all a feature or a function of multiple dialogues. So right up here above this display array, somewhere above, there's going to be the dialog statement. And these two display arrays, the one that displays the array over here on the left and the dialog for the array on the right, are embedded inside this overarching dialog statement. And if you remember from some of our previous sessions, that's required if we want both of these display array dialogs to be active at the same time. So even though you can't see it here with the code examples, I promise you it's there because the user is allowed to drag rows from the left side to the right side or the right side to the left side, and that requires both of these display array dialogs to be active at the same time. So just something to kind of point out, things we've talked about before in previous sessions. All right, so that's the second page we've already looked at. And then finally, the order of execution. You probably already have it figured out by now because we've been looking at this, but when you have, let's say, a display array dialog and you've got all these different drag and drop interaction blocks embedded in it, it's important to know the order of execution, like which interactive block gets executed before which block. So the rules are OnDragStart, of course, is triggered first, and remember that gets triggered in the source dialog where the drag operation starts or begins. Then OnDragEnter is executed or triggered in the target dialog where the user is actually dragging the dragged object. So that's the target dialog. Same thing here for OnDragOver is triggered or executed in the target dialog, and both of these, OnDragEnter and OnDragOver, require OnDrop to be defined in that target dialog. Otherwise, these will not be executed or triggered. And then OnDrop is triggered, and then OnDragFinished, providing that the drag and drop operation aren't terminated or denied. If it gets terminated because of some condition that the code's not happy with, maybe the wrong type of data, or maybe the row that was targeted for the drop operation doesn't accept a drop, then it just triggers OnDragFinished. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. Let me just check here. It is. All right, before we look at those a few examples in Studio, let me check my chat, make sure I didn't have any questions outstanding. Anybody have any questions before we take a quick look at Studio? Okay, let me pop up Studio here real quick. All right, well, let's take first we'll run one of these little simple examples. And remember where I brought these over from. These are all available to you at home. These all just came from our demo directory. If you go to the FGL installation directory, there's a demo directory underneath that that has all of these samples available. I've just imported them here into Studio to make it easier for us to look at the code examples to see what's going on. So I'm going to first start with this one called Simple List. Let's run it. Take a look at what it does. It's very straightforward. This is just a single simple list container, a table container, and the drag and drop operation are just all contained within this single list. So I can just move rows to reposition them in the list. So that's a very straightforward, simple example. So I've already brought the code up so it would be quick for us to look at it. So right here we've got simplelist1.4gl, which is the name of the 4GL source for this example. So let me just point out the highlights here. Here we're defining the array. Just has a name, which is defined as a string, and a price. They're also going to specify some attributes for the array. You probably noticed that some of the elements in the list had different colors and that type of thing. So they're using this attributes array to do that. Here's where we're defining our D&D drag drop object, right, so that we can pass these interaction blocks a reference to the currently dragged object. All of this for loop is just loading the data in our list, so I'm going to skip over that real quickly here. And then finally, here is our display array dialog. And then before display, that's where they're setting their attributes with the set array attributes method to give the list all those nice colors you saw a minute ago. And then here's our first interaction block, our first drag and drop interaction block, the OnDragStart. They're not doing a whole lot in the OnDragStart. They've got looks like a Boolean here that they're setting to true. So what they're trying to do here is track whether or not the drag operation started in the list here, right? So an internal drag operations, in other words. And then they've got the OnDragFinished, and all they're using the OnDragFinished for is when the drop operation is complete, they're using that to reinitialize their variable to false again, to get ready for perhaps the next drag and drop operation. And then the OnDragEnter is being used to make sure that the dragged object is coming from the list itself, right, an internal drag and drop. So they're doing that by checking the value of this drag scene variable. And if it's false, they know that the drag event or operation didn't come from inside the list. It's an external buffer coming in, drag and drop buffer. So they're denying the drop with this set operation and passing it a null. So in other words, they're just going in and checking to make sure that the drag operation initiated inside the list, and if it's not, they're denying the drop. And then OnDrop, if everything worked out okay, then they're using this handy drop internal method that we looked at to do all the coding for them to insert that row into a different location in the list. Very simple and straightforward. All right, so that's drag and drop within a list. Now let's take a look at one that's a little more complicated that we saw in our examples. Let's drag multi. Let's take a look at that. All right, so we saw this example also in our PowerPoint presentation. So here we have two different dialogues, right? Two different display arrays. We have two table containers, right? There's one on the left and one being displayed on the right. And the user is allowed to drag and drop between these two display array dialogues, these two table containers. So I can drag items from the left to the right list and vice versa, and move one from the right to the left. So they can drag and drop in either direction. Also, this example has implemented multiple row selection, if you remember that from a previous session. So the user can actually select multiple rows and drag them to a different list. So let's take a look at that example of code. So we have drag multi.4gl is the source code for that example. So again, just real quickly, here they defined D&D. They're consistent about their variable name as their UI.dragAndDrop object that we'll use when we trigger these interaction blocks for drag and drop. And what we just looked at in our example was a multiple dialogues implementation, right? Because we had the left list and the right list both active at the same time, right? So those display array interactive instructions were both active at the same time. So they had to be embedded inside this dialog statement. So here's the dialog statement we've talked about. Here's the first display array for the left list, right? The list on the left. Down here a little further is the display array, the dialog for the list on the right. And then way down here at the bottom of the second display array is a before dialog block that they've used to actually enable multiple row selection. Right? So set selection mode S left to 1, right? True. So they're turning on multiple row selection for the left list, and then right below that they're turning on multiple row selection for the right list. And the rest of this code we've actually looked at in our presentation. Right? This is the exact code that we were looking at. So here's our display array for the left side with our OnDragStart and OnDragFinished. Of course, we saw that that gets triggered if I'm moving a row from the left side, the list on the left, to the list on the right. And then the dialog for the second list, right, the second display array, we have the OnDragEnter and the OnDrop interaction blocks that get triggered when the user has dragged that object into the visual boundary for the list on the right. That will trigger OnDragEnter. And then when he actually attempts the drop event, that triggers the OnDrop. Okay. Fairly straightforward. Any questions about the code or the examples we saw today? We did really well on time today. It was almost exactly an hour.